Welcome to another episode of Straight Talk About Sales. It's Dr. Nadia, and I am super excited because in today's episode, I switched seats, which means I am on the other side of the mic as we have a special guest who did a takeover, and she asked many questions about me, what's been going on since I decided to add this podcast. And just, to get to know a little bit more about the Dr. Nadia. So tune in as I have this special conversation with one of my really good friends and colleagues, none other than LaVista Jones. Tune in.
Hi, this is LaVista Jones with a special edition of Straight Talk About Sales. This is actually a Boss Talk takeover of another podcast. So I am sitting here with the actual host of Straight Talk About Sales, the one and only Dr. Nadia Brown. Welcome to your own show.
Thank you. It feels interesting to be on this side of the mic.
Yes. Well, you have been on this side of the mic a lot as a podcast guest, but never on your own show.
True.
Yes.
This is a first.
Yeah, this is a first. And interestingly enough, today, the day that we are actually recording this is actually International Podcast Day.
Yeah.
So we had an idea of doing something together because I really would love to share with your audience some of the back ins and outs of your show, especially wrapping up the first season of Straight Talk About Sales. So let's get into it, Dr. Nadia. What was it, or what was the trigger, or what was the thing that was like, oh, podcasting is for me, like this is what I want to do to create this show? What was it?
Well, there were actually a couple different factors. So like you mentioned, I've been a podcast guest. And at one point I think I was doing guest interviews like two or three times a month. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, why aren't you doing your own show? And then I was also doing YouTube, where I was recording content weekly at one point. And so a big push though for making this happen was actually a conversation with you. And you were like, we could put this on a podcast. But I think the biggest block was all the extra work. And I was like, I already have enough on my plate. Mm-hmm. And it just seemed like it was just way too much. Mm-hmm. But after our conversation, it was a lot more doable. But all the extra work though went to your team. So that's why we now have a podcast. Let's be all the way honest. I don't do any extra work as a result of having it.
I love that you don't do any extra work.
Yes.
Like that's a goal that we have when we work with the client. So I'm glad that you don't feel like you have like homework, coming from being the host of your own show. But so let me ask you this, like now that you are ready to wrap up your first full season, what do you wish you had known prior to actually getting started?
I think I wish I would have known how easy it was, because to me, you know how you make up those stories in your mind about how much it's going to be. And even after we had our conversation and when you map things out, it still took me months to pull the trigger. I think you literally had to call me and was like, girl, pick a date and we're going to go live.
This is our launch date, right?
Right. Yeah. And it was like, oh, and then when we got in it, it was like, oh, now it's like, why didn't I do this sooner?
Okay. So greatest lesson learned from having the show, having the team supporting you?
I think the biggest lesson is the team part. Sometimes we have a new idea and we don't pull the trigger on it because we feel like it's a lot more work for us. But when you have team to support you, then it allows you to implement new things. And one of the bigger reasons was that we talked about the podcast was just so I could reach more listeners, doing what I was already doing. And so, because a big thing was just like, how do I grow my audience and how do I have a bigger impact? And you were like, podcast.
The podcast. Now, speaking of work, right? Like, we've established that the show itself is not additional work for you. But I know something that has been work for you is your newest book. So first, just tell the audience, your audience, about your newest book project that is now out in the marketplace, available for people to purchase, read, and get their lives together from a sales perspective.
Oh my goodness.
Tell us about this resource.
So the title of the book is Sell Like a Lady: How to Master Sales with Dignity, Class, and Grace. And it's really a conversation around shifting the perspective on sales and not having it be this icky, sleazy, manipulative, crappy conversation to something that we can do and be ourselves, be authentic. Although I know that word is overused these days, but really just show up. I get to show up as me, and I get to serve as I would naturally serve and work in my business and sales and be able to grow my business. And so I think that a lot of times we feel like we have to shift who we are in order to be good salespeople, and that's not true.
Got it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have additional resources other than just the book. So tell your listeners what resources are out there that actually are, companion resources for the book itself.
So we have the companion journal, and a big part of that is like, and you can relate, you're writing this book, and I would find myself, go grab your journal and answer these questions or do this. And I was like, well, why don't we create a journal? So that's how you have a journal, because it's a lot of emotion and a lot of things and a lot of mindsets that I want you to work through so that you can actually shift them to having a mindset that's actually working for you and not against you. And then we have our revised Courage Diary. The Courage Diary has actually been out there in the marketplace for 5 years. Hard to believe that. And the Courage Diary has always been about being able to track your sales conversations, starting to pay attention to certain trends. And a big one is also the emotions, the things that are coming up. It's kind of like having a sales coach in a book, because it's really inviting you to do a debrief after every single sales conversation. And then you can go back and see, how did it go? Did I feel like it went well? What are things that I would have wanted to do differently? And now you have this resource and it's in writing. And so you can start to see those trends and see where your strengths are and where you may find some weaknesses.
I love that. Now, you talked about emotion, right, a few times, talking about journaling it, right, doing that introspection, doing that with the Courage Diary as well. What would you say is probably like the top emotion that you hear clients, give you feedback on, like, oh, this is how I felt when I was doing this call? Maybe like, what's the top one?
Fear of rejection. What if they say no? I'm like, it's okay if they say no.
So what's your approach to them saying no, right? Because I think that you take a very different approach to sales as a whole than I have ever been taught with sales, right? Coming from like a corporate background, doing some retail work where it's just like, sales is like a big deal. Like, no is not an option because you've got goals you need to make, quotas you need to make, those kind of things. How do you teach us differently, right, about getting those no's?
One, no is not the end of the world, I think. And you mentioned it. And it's one of the reasons why when I shifted into doing this work, I was like, we got to change this whole conversation around sales, because one, no is not the end of the world. So no today doesn't mean no forever. And sometimes no is the best answer. Like, I talk about how your job as a salesperson is to really guide someone to a buying decision. But sometimes the best decision is no. They're not a good fit. It's not the right time. But how you treat them throughout that conversation could still benefit you. But it's just, I think when you go into a sales conversation that I got to get a yes that by any means necessary, that's where you start to really get in trouble.
Got it. I love that. So you are totally helping us to disrupt what we have previously been taught about sales.
Yes. It's not only about closing the sale. It's really about serving the person that's right there in front of you.
Got it. Now that we have this book and we've got the journal and we've got the Courage Diary, tell us, will we be hearing any kind of different content that's like tied to those resources on the show itself?
Actually, yes. I think if you'd asked me this question last week, you might have gotten a different answer. But after we did our live stream and released the book, it was just like, and some of the feedback I've been getting from the audience, it's like, oh my gosh, I really want to hear more, or I really enjoy hearing about the differences between how women or men may sell. And, really starting to talk more about understanding buying cycles and things like that. And at the time I would say, well, no, that's just kind of like how it is, but give the people what they want. So yeah, we'll be talking about that. And then also, spoiler alert, Sell Like a Lady is going to be a series. So there's more content to come. And so I think the podcast will be a great place to start talking about and teasing out some of that content as we get the other books written.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, me and my team, we get to hear everything first.
He's probably over there taking notes. Like, that was good.
So it's like we get to see all of the goodness that is like getting ready to drip out into the marketplace. So I cannot wait. So to build up that anticipation, what can the listeners expect going into season 2?
So season 2, I would really like to talk about the book, and really let's talk more about being disruptive. I think that it's time for me to try that out a little bit more, because when you hear dignity, class, or grace, and you think about sales, like it's almost like those two things don't go together. And so I want to talk more about that, more about the challenges that we particularly as women have when it comes to sales, but also how we can tap into our innate superpowers to really grow our businesses and do it in a way that feels good, that aligns with our values, and it's still allowing us to serve our clients.
Superpowers. So I feel like season 2, we are going to see more of one of your alter egos, Dr. Spice.
Oh, yeah.
On the show. I cannot wait for people to know Dr. Spice. Yes. Talk about a disruptor in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Awesome. So with that, Nadia, I would love for you to, sign off on your own show, since it's a new show. But thank you for allowing me an opportunity to just kind of come over and take over for a few moments to just talk to you with your audience, give them a bit of insight as to what is coming up and what you have learned in your time of, talking to them on the podcast so far. So with that, thank you for the opportunity, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Avista. So as we are wrapping up season 1, thank you so much for joining me. And this is Dr. Nadia with Straight Talk About Sales. I'll see you next season.